From Petersburg, West Virginia here in Grant County. While here, see places such as Petersburg, Mount Storm, and Dolly Sods. We'll also speak with Herold Garber, retired school teacher, principal, and superintendent, and Eileen Sindledecker, owner of the Southside Depot, and they'll both give us a detailed account of some of Grant County's history, culture, and area attractions.
First areas of the earliest settlement into what would become West Virginia. The highways of that day were along waterways, and of course we're on the south branch of the Potomac here in Petersburg, and people came to this area probably in the early to mid 1740s. One of the earliest families of the area were the Meaders. Now, they primarily settled down at Fort Pleasant, just outside Moorfield, but people came up this way, and in fact, not more than a few hundred yards from where we're doing this interview today, there was a mill put up in the earliest days on South Mill Creek, and there are even some stories about Indian incursions here and all that sort of thing. I've always been fascinated by the Indians, and this area was an area that had Delawares and Shawnees and Senecas going back and forth, but when you try to place the name with some of the Indian leadership, about the only one you can come up with is a man named Kilbuck. And Kilbuck was an Indian chief who ended his life out in Ohio on a reservation, but he would talk to people who came from the valley out there on their way west about the days in, well, particularly like 1757. We had a very famous raid on Fort Sybert and Fort Upper Track, and he is renowned for incursions against the early settlers here, and then moved on west. The earliest land, of course, the most desirable land was the river bottom land around the Potomac here, and people kind of became aware of what was here because of some of the early surveys done. Thomas Lord Fairfax, of course, had a vast land grant from the King of England, and they wanted to make sure they knew the parameters of that, and so the very famous Fairfax line was drawn to the headwaters of the Potomac, and that's really out at a corner of Grant County on the mountain, and from that he began to lay off things called the South Branch Manor, the Patterson Creek Manor. Was rather an odd way of ownership. In the beginning, he would just do a quick rent, and you would have to pay every so many years to keep title to your land. But gradually, people were able to purchase their land and begin to do intensive farming. One thing that has always impacted the area, not exactly like the Nile Delta, but we always have floods. And it is almost fantastic to go into some of these river bottom farms and find how deep the topsoil is. Very fine agricultural area, and it always has been. And also, as immigration began, after the better land was taken up, we began to have an influx of early Scotch-Irish and then later German settlers who came here. And an awful lot of our people in the Grant County and Hardy County and Pendleton County areas have German roots, and things that might seem a little foreign to some peoples are staples here, and the fact that people try to eat pork on the first day of the year, and they love sauerkraut and do all the sort of German dishes that came this way. There are nice artifacts, relics, and documents that go way back. I happen to have in my possession a day book done by a Colonel David Van Meter from Hardy County, who raised a militia unit and fought in the War of 1812. It's kind of interesting to read as he goes so far and what their meal was and whose farm they stayed on. Actually, that group of people ended up down in the Richmond, Williamsburg area and were there till the end of the war. The people here have always been hardworking and frugal, and it's interesting to go to some of the land records, census records, to see how things changed over the years. For example, Petersburg here largely was on one side of Main Street, which is just outside this building, and then gradually as they grew they went both ways, but it never was very large until the coming of the railroad, but that's a later part of the story. I particularly like the Civil War era in this area because in doing a good bit of reading and research, I don't know of any area that was quite as split in their loyalties as this area was. Anybody up and down along the Potomac here was likely to have a few slaves, have an affinity for that kind of labor because they had so much land to farm, and because of that they seemed to be for states' rights and for the Virginia militia and all those things. Now again, the slave registries show, depending on what year, from a few in a particular area to it's sort of renowned that supposedly the Neal plantation outside Moorfield had 99 slaves at one time. But slavery was here. But then you get away from the area where slavery was so important. You had people who had migrated to the United States from areas where war had been prevalent, like the German states and so on, and slavery was very foreign to them. So particularly as you get into this area that was Hardy County until 1866, the people toward the mountain and some of the people in town were Unionist in spirit, and then also the people up and down the river bottoms were usually Southern sympathizers and sent their sons to fight for the South. We do have a very well-preserved, in fact, Stan Cohen in his book about West Virginia forts says that the Civil War fortification above Petersburg is one of the best preserved in the state, and it's certainly well worth a visit. It was built by people primarily from Ohio, some Pennsylvanians, many West Virginia units were there, but it's kind of ironic that today, as we're doing this interview, in just a few days, the largest contingent of Union troops to pass through Petersburg went through here prior to the fortification being built up there. It was early in 1862, and Jackson was beginning to show his strength in the Shenandoah Valley, and the Confederate troops had just pulled back somewhat from Yorktown and came into the Shenandoah Valley, and the earliest battle in Jackson's campaign, the Valley Campaign of 1862, was fought down at McDowell, Virginia. Now, the reason Petersburg had some prominence at that time, although a very small town, was that it was only 30-some miles from the railroad. It was really closer by road to 40 miles, but it was New Creek Station that later became Kaiser. And so the troops from the west would be shipped there. They would march here because sometimes they'd get into the Shenandoah Valley by going through Moorfield, and of course the battle that I'm talking about was directly south of here in McDowell, Virginia. That battle was fought on May 8th, and it just boggles my mind thinking how pastoral and peaceful Petersburg is now to have had somewhere between 14 and 20,000 soldiers under people like Major General John C. Fremont, who was called the Pathfinder of the West, and you can read of his exploits. But then there was a General Schenck here who became senator from Ohio and took a lot of leadership in the war. One of the most unique fellows was General Milroy. And when Grant County was formed from Hardee County after the war, they put in 3 magisterial districts. The county was named Grant for Ulysses S. Grant because victorious in the war, a war hero and all like that. Then we have a Grant magisterial district, we have a Union magisterial district, and then our 3rd district is named in honor of General Milroy, a Milroy district, and a lot of people don't know the background of that. Coming to that period of time, the social aspects of the war, the things that really impressed me, regardless of your allegiance, with armies moving back and forth and local partisans like John Hanson McNeil, depending on which side you were on, you always had an enemy at your doorstep. And of course, it was devastating to the people here. They had their crops stolen, their livestock stolen. You probably couldn't find many horses in the area that weren't in military service, and this area was hard hit. However, the allegiances of the war, when West Virginia became a state in 1863, there was an outgrowth that the sentiment was so deep that they felt they had to divide some of these larger counties, and Hardee was a very large county, had to divide it into 2 segments, and for the segment that is toward the mountain and away from the river here, they decided that with its unionist feelings would become Grant County, as I said. So Hardee was virtually cut in half, a little more. Looking at the economy and what people did, most of them, if they didn't have the large bottomlands along the Potomac, were subsistence farmers. They tried to do anything that they could to earn a little extra money. And one thing that always was present, first as a barrier, and then a real asset, were the forests we had here. It's kind of interesting to talk about lumbering in the area, and depending on the era, it could be just farmers going out and cutting wood for their own use and then trying to sell logs, but transportation was always the problem there. But one thing they began to do was that later in the 19th century, they began to more intensively get into the tanning industry. And the forest around here was replete with chestnut oak trees and everything. And so almost every farmer at the right time of the year, if they had a wood lot, would go out and begin to fell some of the trees and take the bark. And bark was a real commodity in demand. And as you go up and down the river estuaries here, you can go to certain dates and find when the first tannery was created. And Petersburg had a very, very large tanning operation. It probably went up into the 60s, maybe early 70s before it closed. Moorfield kept a tannery a little longer than that. Franklin had one. But every community seemed to have a tannery, and bark production was very important. Sometime around the turn of the century, bigger companies began to see, and this was really when population growth in the United States took off. They needed lumber for homes. And so you begin to hear of big lumber companies going to the red hemlock areas on Dolly sods and on the mountaintop that looks sometimes tundra-like and almost barren, but at one time they had huge forests, and year after year after year they began to take these trees out. One particular company that I like to think about is one that probably was in the Petersburg area as late as 1910, just a little bit south of here, and it was a Pennsylvania firm. It was called the Keystone Lumber Company. And I was very interested in their activities because an area, as a young man that I hunted in, very rugged. You wouldn't have thought that they could have done anything in a mechanized way in that area, but you can still go there today and find rails and things like that where they would run these little dinghies up the hollow, and that there are several tracks of logging railroads throughout Grant County. Thinking thinking of the history of Grant County again, Petersburg itself took a real boost about 1910 with the coming of the railroad. We're filming this in the Chamber of Commerce area of the Southside Depot, and this area became a boomtown. And one little sidelight that I find interesting, if you go to the 1910 census, U.S. Census, and look at Grant County, you would think that we had a huge, and for that time, we did have a very large population of Italian families because there were so many workers brought in that particular year of the census, and they were enumerated here. But of course, we do have Italian families, but they moved on and followed the growth of the railroad further to the west. Many of them did. People coming into the area now will look at maybe Hardy County as a more industrial center with the Pilgrim Industries down there, both for the processing of live birds and then the extra processing for products like wingdings and other things. We have had our industrial manufacturing areas here. Sadly now, some of them are closed. We had during these 60s, 70s, into the 80s, SCM Allied Agri, which was a large printing concern, largely dealing in government forms and all that sort of thing. But as I've already said, we've come back to things like the forest industries that'll always be here. We have cutting of the trees, the processing of the trees, and now the further processing of the trees with making more finished products, which is an important aspect of that. I neglected to say anything much about the time in 1866 when the county was formed. It was rather interesting to find that these people who had no really large towns around, how they would try to plot out where they would put their county seat. We have Petersburg, which is very far south in the county, and then more midway we have Maysville, and then on the top of the mountain, as we refer to it down here, we Flatlanders, you have places like Bayard and Mount Storm and Gormania. And I suppose the people setting up the county, because an awful lot of them were from the Shear area, which is north of Maysville, they said we ought to try to find a geographical center for our county seat. So about 1.5 miles above Maysville, there was a place that was named in that time Laurelton. And they decided to put the first county seat in Laurelton because it was almost the geographical center of Grant County. It had a rude 2-story log cabin there that they used temporarily for a courthouse, but the intention was to move the courthouse back to Maysville. Maysville, just a little south of it, and the courthouse became, as it were, a political football, with it being in Maysville for a while, moved to Petersburg, went back to Maysville, and then population growth here in the southern part of the county made it stay here. Now, you know, a lot of times people talk about Grant County as what happened around Petersburg, but there was a large number of people working both mines and the lumber areas of the northern part of the county, and Bayard and Mount Storm and Gormania grew in size, got a railroad before Petersburg did. Bayard was the first incorporated town in Grant County rather than Petersburg. Petersburg's just over 100 years old now in 2012. And they had actually had a high school with high school graduations before Petersburg did. They also had a lot of ethnic groups. You can still find names of many Italian families up there. But of course, as the woods were cut, and sometimes the climate seemed to be very rough about year-round farming and all that sort of thing, population dwindled, and as I said, the population area is now around Petersburg, but again, many important things going on in the mountaintop area. chief of which is something that Grant County is always known for, the West Virginia Power Company, Dominion Power. In the old days, people used to refer to it as the Pepco Power Station, but it certainly has been an economic plus for the growth of the county. And I think originally they did not intend it to be such a longevity issue for them. They thought it would not go on so long, but that was instituted back in the 60s, and it's still a very going concern now. And we have power lines going through the southern part of Grant County on their way to the Washington, D.C. area, and also south to the Richmond area. We're in a kind of a triangular place here. The one thing that's always been with us are the floods. I am to the age where I can remember 3 or 4 bad ones, but it used to be a watchword around here that you're going to have a flood about every 12 years, a major flood. As you study the photographic history of Grant County, the one that was well documented to begin with was in 1924, and it primarily would not reckon with the later ones, but it certainly devastated the area near where we are now in South Petersburg. But then there was a very major flood in 1936. There was a major flood that I remember as my first flood in 1949. But people still talk about the flood of '85. As they reckon floods, you know, sometimes they refer to 100-year floods. I have heard the '85 flood in the eastern part of West Virginia and, of course, surrounding states being referred to as the 500-year flood, and that was something that transformed many things around our town. We lost several old businesses, some that weren't brought back. We've recovered. Thankfully, the railroad was rebuilt into town, and we have industries that are tied into that. Allegheny Wood Products, Allegheny Dimensions. We have a railhead for the loading of metallurgical quality lime and so on. Greer in Pendleton County brings lime down to load on cars to take to the steel centers. And we're on our way back, but the floods have really been a part of our history. And as a postscript, we got off schedule with the 12-year plan, and people laugh about that, but there was a fairly major flood that hit Hardy County, maybe harder than us, back in 1996. The education of our kids has always been a challenge that has been met head on, but the one thing is we have a population center on the mountain. We have a population center down in the valley. At the time where the schools were just being upgraded, there was a great debate about, do we try to make a centrally located big high school? And there was a lot of debate of getting the school away from Petersburg out to the sheer area and so on to bring the people off the mountain. It was finally decided to, in the building program, build 2 high schools. Union High School, which is along US Route 50 on the mountain, Petersburg High School down here. The debate continues. We are in a challenge period of slowly declining enrollments, but we know that education is just one of the things that has to be done for our youth, for our economy, and for the kids. There are so many beautiful historic areas here, and that's really my love. If you want to come to the area, there are many brochures out now that tell about these things, but we have beautiful spots listed on the National Register of Historic Places. You can start right here in town and look at what the old-timers called the Old Courthouse on Virginia Avenue. It was interesting to look at old maps of that particular street, Virginia Avenue, which harks back to before the Civil War, but I have seen on the maps Moorfield Turnpike. And of course, that was a feature of the old days where improved roads really charged toll for driving cattle or you walking or riding along them, and we have them north and south and east and west here. We are always related to the outdoors and the beauty of nature. One of the oldest trout hatcheries around in the state of West Virginia is the Petersburg Trout Hatchery, which is a few miles outside of town toward an area called Royal Glen, a very beautiful spot on the Potomac. It was at this where one of the early supervisors was able to identify a different strain or a mutant strain of trout, and we became known as it was developed as the home of the golden trout. And that's something, of course, that we take rightful claim to. Also, much later, but it's been in existence a long time now, Spring Run Trout Hatchery, much, much larger, putting out many more fish, but you would be surprised at the destinations of some of our fish trucks going out here, because they go all over the eastern part of West Virginia, and it is an economic base. It's a great place to hunt. Most of the land would appear to be private land, but that's not really the case. We have the Monongahela National Forest, and we have the George Washington National Forest close. And if you want to come and hunt, there are national lands that you can be hunted on. I love my hometown, and having graduated from Petersburg High School in '59, then away for a number of years to college and so on, came back to teach, and that gave me real opportunities to work with the young people of the community. Honestly, some of the kids didn't think in my era that college was ever a possibility. And of course, government programs have opened up, and again, we have so many fabulous graduates from this who made a contribution. But in my, let's say, 50 years of adulthood, I've seen a real interest in the history of our area. Back in the 1960s, we formed the Grant County Historical Society to try to make sure we could preserve and record the history of Grant County and pass that on to other generations. We have a fabulous entertainment center, community center, the Landis Arts Center, where you can find productions from the road, but some of the most meaningful ones are the kids who get involved in things up there. We encourage our children in the arts, visual arts, dramatic arts. Music is always important around here, and again, this is a great center for that. One thing that I was thinking about my own childhood that has left us after the flood as an aftermath of that, we used to have a theater. In the old days it was called the Alpine, then the Seneca Theater, where you could go for a 7 o'clock show each weekday night or a 9 o'clock show, and we kids liked the 2 o'clock matinee on Saturday afternoon. That's gone, and we have to leave Petersburg to see a theater performance, movie performance, but of course we have our video stores, and the thing that's leaving me behind now is the technology that comes out. Almost every kid's carrying a smartphone, and I'm trying to learn how to use one. But anyway, Petersburg is just a microcosm of what's the best.
We have tons of things to do, from fishing and hiking. We have dolly sods. It's this great hiking and camping. We have all kinds of fishing up at Harmon's North Fork Cottages and Smoke Hole Caverns and around Big Bend Campground. We have all kinds of other activities to do as far as shopping. We have antiques, and we have our store here at the Southside Depot, which is West Virginia Made Crafts, and they're crafts from all over West Virginia. And our building also houses the CVB, which is the Convention and Visitors Bureau. We also house the Chamber of Commerce, and we run the Visitors Information Center. Smoke Hole Caverns is just up the road right out of Petersburg here. It has some great caverns that are open year-round, so you can come at any time here in Grant County and visit the caverns. They have the world's longest ribbon stalactite in their caverns. They're opening a brand new gift shop and restaurant, which is phenomenal. And of course, they have cabins, and they have catch and release in the ponds, and beautiful place to visit here in Grant County.